It's that sort of circular logic that frustrated opponents of voter photo ID and led to charges that the authors of the constitutional amendment really didn't want to answer questions about what it really did.
I just want to know what you're looking for in addition that's on an ID that wouldn't be in this poll book.
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, a photo alone is an unreliable way.
It's not a photo alone, Representative Kiffmeyer. That's what I just said. And you know that's the case. She never answers the questions, Mr.
Well, Representative Thiessen,
you've had plenty of chances.
Representative Thiessen.
Over and over, the scene was repeated. Democrats wanted information, and the bill's authors sidestepped questions.
So we have two classes of voters. We have the absentee voters who could just use the last four digits of their Social Security number. The voters going into the voting booth in 2012 don't know that. They're going on the idea that all voters will have to show a valid photo ID, when in fact 20% of them won't know. How do you educate the voters looking at your proposed amendment that says all voters?
Representative Kiffmeyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Scalzi and members. I think you underestimate the fact that already 80% of Minnesotans have said that they support a photo ID requirement. Those who vote an absentee ballot are already familiar with the process, and I think it will be, you take that basis, that current basis, and I'm sure there will be lots of voter education going on before the election day as well by everybody whose name is on the ballot, by all these supporting groups, and I am absolutely confident they will be able to communicate the information. But I think most importantly, every voter stands in line and casts their ballot. They have personal experience with voting. They have personal experience with registering. They have personal experience already. And so the simple language of the constitutional amendment, I think, to the large majority of people is pretty straightforward and quite clear.
Common Cause of Minnesota suggests that one reason the bill's authors couldn't answer those questions directly is that they really didn't actually write the bill.
We released a report earlier this year that found over 60 model bills that were drafted by ALEC that have been introduced in the Minnesota State Legislature. And they bring the two groups together of corporate lobbyists and legislators, and they sit and draft these bills. And these bills are all designed to really pad the bottom line of these corporations. And so then they bring those bills home, make a few changes to them, sort of do a quick cut and paste job, and then introduce them in Minnesota. And it just shows you the level of which legislators just, again, copy and paste without really thinking twice before putting it forward. And you saw this clearly on the photo ID amendment. Mm-hmm. Numerous questions were asked of the bill authors about what does this mean or what does that mean, and the authors couldn't answer any of the questions at all.
Yeah.
And so it's just shocking to me that legislators are pushing these bills forward without really understanding it.
But while the content and intent of the constitutional amendment was somewhat vague, the language that voters would see this November is even more vague. Here's what voters are going to see on the ballot. A simple question with 35 words, and that includes the part that says yes or no. But this is what it's talking about, something that is several paragraphs long and 228 words long. This talks about provisional ballots. There's a whole paragraph on that. That's nowhere in the question. And also in this, it mentions a government-issued ID. A valid ID is how it's addressed in the question, though.
Trying to get an answer out of Representative Kiffmeyer is very, very hard. She's skilled at evading questions about it. Or she'll say that, well, the legislature can come back in 2013 and fix it. But the language doesn't say that. Other states that have done this have put an explicit language in, like Mississippi, saying, legislature, come back next year and you can fill in the blanks and do the enabling language. Not so here. So ironically, though it's often conservatives who talk about judges legislating from the bench, here Representative Kiffmeyer is begging judges to legislate from the bench because only they will be able to come up with these terms.
And nobody knows what the words mean. The words say substantially equivalent verification standards, but the author of the bill, Representative Kiffmeyer, won't answer what that means.
The two things that are the most significant about it is that we have retained language in the bill that talks about in-person voting and not in-person voting. That language is there on purpose because if you read the Crawford case, which is the U.S. Supreme Court case, the majority of the court talks about those two different types of voters. And that's, what we're trying our best to do is to conform our language with Crawford. And in doing so, we recognize that we are dealing with a constitutional issue, and we are doing our best to conform with that language.
Vote on this proposal was on strictly party line basis, and some who were voting for it expressed privately to reporters who then reported that they did not feel like they had a choice in how to express their own concerns. Governor Carlson, Governor Pawlenty, Governor Dayton have said the same thing over and over and over. If you want to make big radical changes in election law, it should only be done when there's very broad agreement and support. Otherwise, all you have is lawsuits, bitterness, partisanship accusations, back and forth, and chaos is the word that some people use to describe when there's all of that going on.
The justices will hear this case on July 17th. Then they have to act with high speed for a court. They have to have a ruling done by the end of August. That's because the ballots need to be printed by then. With producer Allison Herrera, I'm Mike McEntee for the UpTake.